Hello, everybody. Welcome. This is 2023's last lineup event. So thank you for being here. We're excited. And thank you for being patient with us for the delay. We are just always sort of troubleshooting some technological issues. So thank you for being patient. Today, we have a really special lineup event for you. As always, we're pleased to be partnering with Mystery to Me Bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin to present this series. We love working with them and they do a really good job. And if you find yourself interested in one of these books, please support Mystery to Me. They're doing really great work. And purchase your copy directly from them. We have a special discount code for you too. If you click that little green button there at the bottom, there is some information about that discount code, but it is endings, ENDINGS 30, and that will get you 30% off. And these books have book plates signed by our authors that we have here today. So do think about it. It's good until December 31st. So if you need some last minute Christmas presents or holiday presents, that's a good use for those. And this series, if you're new to it, if this is your first lineup event, is focused on highlighting Soho crime authors and giving them a digital platform to talk about their work alongside other Soho crime authors. So, a few more housekeeping things before we begin. All of these events are live streamed and they're also recorded. So if you just really would like to send this to a friend afterwards, you can always send it to them by using this link or play it back going to the archive page on our Lineup Crime website page. Finally, there is a Q&A button on the right side of your screen. So if you have any questions for either of the authors or both of the authors today, you can put that in and we will get to as many of those as we can before the end. So thank you for being here. We're excited to end the year with such a great event. We've got Chris McKinney here and Stephanie Barron. And so I am going to, yes, and you know what? Thank you for saying that, Stephanie. Stephanie is invisible today. And that's okay. We just had some tech issues, but we're really glad that you're still joining us, Stephanie.
Me too.
I'm going to read a little bit about these folks, and then we'll dive into some questions. Stephanie Barron is a graduate of Princeton and Stanford Universities, where she studied history. A former intelligence analyst at the CIA, she is the author of 30 novels, including the critically acclaimed Mary Folger series, which she writes under the name Francine Matthews. She lives and works in Denver, Colorado. Her latest novel, Jane and the Final Mystery, is the 15th and final installment in her Being a Jane Austen mystery series. The critically acclaimed series reimagines Jane Austen as an amateur sleuth who has won the hearts of thousands of fans, crime fiction aficionados and Janeites alike, with her tricky plotting and breathtaking evocation of Austen's voice. Jane and the Final Mystery brings Jane's final season and the final murder investigation to brilliant and poignant life in an unforgettable conclusion. Chris McKinney was born and raised in Hawaii on the island of Oahu. He has written 9 novels, a co-authored memoir, and the screenplays for 2 featured films and 2 short films. He is the winner of the Elliott Cades Award and 7 Kapalapala Po'akela Awards. And he has been appointed visiting distinguished writer at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. His latest novel, Sunset Water City, is the final installment of his sci-fi noir Water City trilogy. Set in the 22nd century, the trilogy follows a nameless anti-hero and his daughter as they navigate a post-apocalyptic world touched by climate change and the fanatic influence of a late deified scientist. McKinney's satisfying conclusion to the trilogy further interrogates faith, power, and tech. So welcome, you two, and congratulations on wrapping up your series this year.
Thank you.
Big. And Chris McKinney's book is out today. The final book is... The birthday is today, so congratulations on that, Chris.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Today we are discussing and celebrating the release of the last book in each of your series, but we're also celebrating the series as a whole. So can you each talk about your vision and process for creating your series? And did you plan the whole series from the beginning, or did some of these things sort of happen organically? Just talk to us about your process.
Chris, you go first. You're the birthday. You go first.
Okay, thank you. I didn't really originally when I wrote a very early first draft of book 1. I didn't have really a series in mind. It was more of a question. So Amara Hoshijo, who was my editor at the time at Soho, she asked early on, could this be a series? And I just said, I can try. And it's just sort of yeah. And then I started thinking about it, and then puzzle pieces started to sort of flip together, and yeah, I was able to take what was originally conceived of as a standalone novel and turn it into 3 books.
So I started writing this series in 1994, and the first book came out in 96. So I have been writing about Jane Austen over the past 3 decades, roughly. But it covers 15 years in her life, and there are 15 books. That I never intended. The round number, the corollary between her life and my publishing, but it just happened to fall out that way. I definitely knew I wanted to follow the arc of her life from the point where I started, which was Jane at age 26, and I chose that particular moment in her life, which was in 1802, when she both accepted and then retracted a young man's proposal of marriage. She kind of, at that point, I felt was at a turning point in her life where she was choosing at the age of 26 essentially to remain unmarried, because that was considered an advanced age to be unmarried in her time. Jane lived from 1775 to 1817, which is a period of time in England bracketed by war. The American Revolution on the eve of her birth, and then Waterloo right before her death. And so I knew I wanted to embed her life very much in the conflict at the time and use her as a guide through the late Georgian and Regency period. I debated whether to conclude the series with her actual death, which I essentially do. There is a terminus when you write about someone who actually lived. Historically, you absolutely know the arc of their lives. But I had to then determine how my character, who is obviously my mental creation, not necessarily an authentic vision of Austen, would navigate that process. And so, yeah, I kind of, the whole aspect of a final novel was something I had to grapple with. Because many people said, "Oh, why don't you just go back and you could write about her infinitely. You could put novels in the gaps between the existing ones and yada yada yada." I didn't want to do that either. I felt it would disturb the reader's arc to have to go back and re-enter a period in her life that had been missed. So, yeah, I think it was both a process that was organic and one that was definitely planned.
Thank you for that. I have sort of a follow-up question to that, Stephanie, in a little bit that we'll touch on. But yeah, thank you for talking to us about that, both of you. Both of these books, outside of both occupying space within the crime genre, are in very different worlds. The Water City series takes place in a spec-fic, apocalyptic version of our future, whereas the Being a Jane Austen mysteries are placed in the past, and obviously reimagines the life of a very well-known historical figure. Both worlds likely involved a lot of research to build. So can you each talk about your research process and what you decided to include versus what you decided to exclude? Stephanie, do you want to go first this time?
No, I want Chris to go first.
I respect it.
Yeah. Research was it was interesting to me because a lot of the research that I had to do was sort of STEM research, scientific research, engineering research, and have an understanding that when I bend something or do something that seems sort of improbable, that it needs to have purpose. So, for example, the books center around this telescope that is on basically on the Big Island on Hawaii, but I leave sort of that out because certain things happened over the years where Hawaii isn't really Hawaii anymore. But this idea that we're in the future and there's this telescope on this mountain, and it has an actual sort of eyepiece that the scientist looks through is preposterous, right? That's not how telescopes work. But it's sort of like, understanding that when I do something that is just not really scientifically viable, what I'm kind of saying is commenting on sort of the lack of common understanding on how science and technology works. So people buy it. Like because there's such a gap in knowledge when it comes to that kind of stuff, it's sort of like it's easy to manipulate and sell something that's not true because it's so complex and so hard to learn about. So basically that was the extent of my research. Is just science stuff, physics, marine biology, astronomy and stuff like that. And so it was fun. I mean, it's an excuse to learn more.
I think that's a really important point. I have found, and I've said throughout my writing career, that in many respects, I write a book in order to do the research for it. And that's, I write a lot of standalones as well as the series novels. And so that's always been true. If I find something that intrigues me, I will educate myself about it. And then invariably, I find a story buried in the research that I feel compelled to tell. And that to me is the creative process, but it's also the writer's gift of unearthing stories. In the case of the Jane Austen series, the gift of writing something historical is that there is a certain fixed aspect to what you are researching. I've also written highly contemporary terrorism books, and that is like journalism. You're constantly chasing the latest developments, and I think that that's hampering to the novelistic process. With Jane, I had started to study her period, which is classically known as the Regency, but I broadened to the Napoleonic Wars, the period of the Napoleonic Wars in Britain, which roughly, in her case, followed the course of the series. So Napoleon had a peace called the Peace of Amiens in 1801 to 1804, and that's when the series begins. So it begins with peace, but devolves into constant warfare. And Jane had two brothers who fought in Nelson's Navy. They were post captains. She read newspapers constantly. She was very, very engaged with the politics and the developments of every single year of that period. Which is a common misconception that people carry of Jane Austen, that she lived retired and confined in a small English village. In fact, because her father died, she was itinerant. Her family had very little money, and the women in her family in particular were constantly changing lodgings into various towns in England. And so I found it rich terrain. I could position her in different parts of England almost every year. And she would experience new people, new events, new context in the evolution of that time, that decade that she is positioned in. And so it was a constant backdrop for me to exploit. I also used her letters as my primary source material. And there are 158 surviving letters between Jane and primarily her sister Cassandra, but also other members of her family. And they give you her voice, but it's her intimate voice. It's not the carefully edited, massaged voice of the novels, which I also attempt to employ in narrative passages of the books, but I present them as journals so that I am highlighting that intimate voice of Jane Austen from her letters, which is viciously funny and acutely observational of human character and motive. All of which are essential to a detective.
Yeah, and Stephanie, I mean, that's something that you have certainly received a lot of accolades for, is how well you employ that voice of Jane Austen's in your books. If you haven't read any of the books of the series, it is really wonderful to read.
Well, thanks.
You're welcome. Chris, I wanted to kind of touch back to you on a question. The Water City trilogy is your first foray into science fiction. And even just hearing you talk about, all of the stuff that you've researched for it, it's a really, you're really creating a very complicated and interesting and intricate world. And so I wanted to know what prompted you to jump into the genre with not only one novel, but with a trilogy.
I've always been a fan of the genre, whether it be books or film or even video games. So it's kind of weird. It's sort of like I think back to grad school, and when back then, when you did sort of you did a master's in creative writing, it was always very sort of you must do literary fiction kind of stuff, and other stuff like genre fiction was almost kind of discouraged. And
Scorned.
so,
You can say scorned.
uh,
I said you can say scorned.
yeah, scoring. Yeah. So it never. I mean, really, it's kind of strange. So for years, it never occurred to me to try to write anything else but that. And then at a certain point, I, as I read more and more sci-fi and fantasy and stuff, I just wanted to give it a try, do something different. Plus, this is a small place, right? And I wrote, I guess seven books set here, and then they're all sort of contemporary novels. And I I think I sort of exhausted my knowledge of my own home, so it was just and I need to write, so I had to choose something, and always been a fan of sci-fi, so that's sort of what steered me in that direction.
I think we tend to write as genre writers what we love to read. And so, I think that's an important motivator when you sit down to create an imaginary world. It's where you're comfortable living mentally.
Yeah, absolutely. I also was curious. You have a really wonderful web page, Chris, where you talk about sort of like the building of Water City, and I believe it's watercitybooks.com for anybody that's curious about it.
Watercitytrilogy.com.
Watercitytrilogy.com. There's all these really wonderful illustrations, and it's a really cool deep dive into the world, that very intricate world that he's built. But you do talk there a little bit about how current events sort of impacted your writing process.
Yeah.
So can you talk about that here?
Yeah, I mean, it started really essentially it started with the telescope. So there's this controversy on the Big Island about building a telescope, a 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea, and there were a lot of protests and all of that. And I started thinking about is how I mean, I guess the way it is, I feel like culture is invaluable, and anything that sort of damages it is, even if you're doing it in the name of technology or advancement, is not a great thing. So I knew I wanted a telescope. I also, at the time, I was living in a condo, that's close to the beach and stuff, and I'd be out on the balcony and just wonder what would it look like if all of these condominiums kind of were just flipped upside down and stuck underwater. And I'm sorry, what was the question again? I feel like I'm drifting away.
How did current events inspire?
Oh, yeah.
This is
And then,
great.
and then there's the other stuff. There's the Bezoses and Musks of the world. And it's sort of like this idea of, I personally know people who practically worship Elon Musk, and I don't judge it or anything like that, but I find it very interesting. So it's sort of like, I guess, those sort of billionaire types are kind of, I felt like if we advance that, say, 100 years, how much bigger is the disparity of wealth going to be? How much power are people like that going to have, and how will they use that power? Because let's say that they want to do something in the banner of making the world a better place, and people buy in. That's that to me, that's a disturbing amount of influence. And I think that it might be where we're headed. So yeah, so that those were the sort of telescope rich people. Yeah, current events. Yep.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for speaking about that.
Yeah.
Stephanie, I'm turning over to you now. We're going to go back in time,
Okay.
quite significantly for Jane. This is what I was sort of alluding to earlier, is when you're talking about how when you're writing the past, you kind of have these, more or less set time periods that you can research within. And I feel like historical fiction authors often are like walking a tightrope between keeping their novels historically accurate, but also creating these unique fictional circumstances. And this would allow you to both include, but also need to leave out quite a bit of research. So, and it's just a balancing act. So, how do you balance the task of keeping Jane's life historically accurate, but also telling a great story?
I've approached it two different ways, and you can see that if you go through the series. Some of the books hew strictly to a particular letter that she wrote. So, for example, she was in Lyme Regis, which is the setting she uses in Persuasion, one of the settings she uses in Persuasion, her final novel that she wrote when she was dying. She was in Lyme, 1803, 1804. She wrote a letter to her sister that was highly detailed, a series of letters that week. And in it, she names every single person she met in Lyme. She recounts evenings that she spent with them, with whom her mother played whist, whether there was moonlight, because if there was moonlight, you could go out in a carriage and actually be out in the evening. If there was no moonlight, you couldn't. She even mentioned a doctor she saw for a cold, and the doctor turned out, when I did research, to be the coroner. So I knew she knew the coroner, which is a really useful thing when you're going to have a murder investigation in a town. So that book, every single person she mentions is a character in the story from the letter. And I had an entire chronology of her week. So I knew when she went bathing in a bathing machine off the coast of Lyme, for example. One of the people is a victim, one's the murderer, So that's a very prescriptive sort of approach to a novel. It's a mosaic, I would say, from fact and fiction. In other instances, I looked at a gap. Her sister Cassandra is known and reviled, unfortunately, in the Austen world for having destroyed certain letters, and there are gaps in the correspondence. And I would say, okay, what happened and why did Cassandra destroy this bunch of letters? So that they don't come down to history. And I fill those gaps with my fiction. Generally, they're rooted in whatever I happen to know was occurring in England at the time. But they tend to track with where Jane was historically at that moment in a given year. But they are entirely fictional. Another aspect I've had to explore is that most of her family members are characters in the book, or rather the series. But then there are a few fictional characters who are continuing characters. And that is definitely a license I've taken with Jane's life. The most notable being Raphael West, who is the son of the painter Benjamin West. I have her meeting him and knowing him. And then another completely fictional character named Lord Harold Trowbridge, who becomes a love interest of hers early on in the series and then unfortunately disappears from the series. So yeah, it's a balancing act, as you say.
I really like using the word mosaic. That feels really representative of what it is.
Yeah, I prefer it to pastiche, for instance.
Not blame you there. Going even further back, like to the very beginning, what was it about Jane Austen that inspired you to turn her into an amateur sleuth? Was there like a particular book or a work of hers that made you decide that this life was meant for her?
It was her voice. I started writing the first Jane when I was pregnant with my son, Sam. And for me, I've told the story a lot, so forgive me if you're in the audience and you've heard it before, but for me, pregnancy was a hallucinatory experience. And I had lapses of memory. I, at times was so inattentive. I had a car accident while I was pregnant. I mean, just a variety of things. But I was hearing voices, and I had been reading Austen that year, and one of the voices I heard was Jane's. And I started speaking like her, just without being aware of it. My husband would come home and he'd say, "How'd your day go?" And I'd say, "Well, it being evident the weather should continue fine, we determined upon a pleasure party to the lake." It was just rattling out of me. And I thought, I've got it. What struck me is that our present age is so impoverished in terms of language. We communicate in emoji. We live via text. And it's always designed to convey the minimum of information and very little emotion in as quickly a method as possible. And when you read Austen's dialogue, what you discover is that it tends to be replete with meanings that operate on about 4 different levels among the characters. And that richness really compelled me. I knew I wanted to try to use that voice, but I didn't want to bludgeon people with Austenese. So I thought I had to give them a plot that would be capable of pulling them through the writing, that they would sort of submit to the writing because they were engaged by the plot. And that was my hope. I also knew I didn't want to continue any of her characters because they're very special to me. I think each reader has their own conception of a given author's characters, and to meddle with that is something you do at your peril. But I felt that no one had a particularly fixed sense of Jane herself. She's pretty opaque behind Lizzie Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy and Marianne Dashwood. So I felt I could embody her and use her language and use the history of her time to position her differently than her characters. So that was kind of the idea.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Folks in the audience, this is a great time to put in any questions that you have. I've got one more question that I want to ask both of you, and then we can start taking some questions from the audience. But you both have spent a lot of time with Jane and with the family in the Water City series, and you spend so much time working on these folks and their lives and their personalities. And so what is it like to end a series and say goodbye to characters? Is it emotional, or is it like you're ready to be on to the next project? Chris, I suppose you're starting first.
For me, it's sort of like any other sort of writing any other book. It's once you conceive of the ending, it's almost as if you're or at least I'm racing towards the finish line. And it's so there's no sadness in it. It's just, there's the goal, and then there's accomplishing the goal. But I really do like that moment when you envision the ending, and then it's just a very, I guess, eureka kind of moment. And upon completion is just, I think I feel probably more a sense of relief than accomplishment. And I'm always ready to move on to the next one. So yeah, that was my experience with it.
I had a very different experience. And I think that's because I've been wandering through Jane Austen's mind for 3 decades now. Yeah. And my sense of Austen's place in world culture and the history of literature is that she endures because she understands human motivation so well. And her perceptions remain relevant over time. She teaches us a lot about how to live, particularly as women. And that's why we find her stories compelling. But I think as I approached her death, I realized she was teaching me a lot about how to survive loss. And I lost my 24-year-old son a year ago as I was writing this book, uh, which was devastating and horrifying. And I had to suspend writing it for a period of 3 months or so. And when I went back, I just found that looking at how she confronted the end of her own life with grace, she's still teaching me how to live. So I tried to be immensely respectful of that process as I finished this series.
Yeah. Thank you both for sharing. We do have questions, a few. Thank you if you've been submitting them. We're going to start with Justin's question. What do you guys do to motivate yourselves or inspire yourselves to write?
I mean, it's a compulsion. I mean, it's fun. It's interesting too I think maybe to talk about this in the context of Jane Austen. Why did she write? She didn't need to write, right? It's just sort of like I think that somebody like Jane Austen, is the model of somebody who can't help themselves. And I think that's kind of a lot of us are sort of in that boat. It's not even really about motivation. It's compulsive behavior, and for me at least. My mood changes. A lot of things, daily habits, sort of feel, I guess, less fulfilling if I'm not doing this activity. So it's almost almost like a mental health thing. I just need to do it in order to feel okay.
Mm-hmm. Well, I always tell people this. I think it's much harder to motivate yourself to write when it's not legitimated by having sold. And I say that not to undermine or devalue the process of writing without ever having any intention to sell it. But there's a ratification of the process when you know your book is going to be published and you have a deadline and a publishing house's staff waiting to handle the work. I think one of the great threats to any creative process is the people around you devaluing and delegitimizing it. So people who aspire to be published and who write a novel or are struggling to write a novel are very often told by the people around them, oh, you don't have to do that today. Just, put it aside. Come do this. It's a hobby. It's something you're playing with. It's not legitimate. It's not earning you any money. And so the temptation to devalue it yourself and to regard it as just this pipe dream or fantasy that you're playing with takes root. And that's the difficult time to motivate yourself to write in a coherent way that's not just, amorphous journal writing, which I've also done and find valuable, but to have the commitment to an outline, a story arc, a set of people in your world, a beginning, a middle, and an end is an endurance test. And you need the support and the legitimation of the people around you for that process. So I have a great deal of sympathy with anybody attempting to write. I was fortunate in getting my first novel published, which is unusual. And had I not succeeded in that, I probably would have gone on and done something else rather than, written 5 drafts of novels that never went anywhere over 10 years. One of my writing teachers was a man named John McPhee, who is a staff writer for The New Yorker at the age of 95 still, and has written myriad books. But he attempted to be published for 10 years by The New Yorker. And that's because if you are published by The New Yorker, you are immediately a staff writer of The New Yorker. You're not just sort of somebody who's doing a gig story for them. And it mattered to him so much. But my God, on year 7.5, on year 2, I would have said, okay, we're going to do something else here. It's a very tough thing to search for that kind of motivation. And I have a lot of sympathy with it.
It's endlessly interesting to me how different writers viewed writing as a craft. So thank you for sharing. It's just so personal to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we've got a question from MM, and it's for Jane, but I'm going to extend it to Chris as well. Is there any writing advice you've learned or absorbed from studying Jane's own genius life and processes? But Chris, I also am curious if there's anything specific you wrote or you learned about your craft through exploring a different genre and maybe doing a trilogy.
I think I'm fine with Stephanie answering the Austin question. I can because I'm kind of curious about the answer myself. So
Legit.
yeah.
All right, Stephanie.
Well, I think one of the things that she valued is something I value, which is strength, intellectual strength, predominating over the sort of superficial qualities that draw people to one another. All of her female characters that she values have significant intelligence, and it is the power of their minds that brings them success in life. And so she also is adept at portraying the incredible foibles of the human condition and the absurdities that each of us carry, and the interactions that are, ridiculous. And so the underlying humor of her writing was very important to me. And I think as I've gone through life, I'm now 60, humor has been the sustaining thing that has allowed me to survive. And I think that's true of Jane as well. So when I write about very serious and complex and personally difficult issues, I try always to do so in a way that has an element of irony to it, because, it's the ability to laugh at yourself and at the world that is eventually your chief survival skill, in my view.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, this is a question from Andy. Were there any books or points in each of your series that you are especially proud of, or are you just proud of the series as a whole? Or both?
Chris, you're up.
Okay. I don't know if I would use the word pride. It's I have the privilege of doing something that I really enjoy doing. That doesn't mean it's easy. It's very challenging. There are often roadblocks. I think I heard a neuroscientist once say that human beings are most stimulated by frustration and a little bit of frustration and anger, more so than sort of what you would normally think would be more stimulating or more pleasing to the brain. And really, it's sort of like I'm just so happy and grateful that I can indulge in this activity that I enjoy so much, that challenges me, that forces me to learn new things. I can't think of anything else I'd rather do. And it doesn't necessarily just have to be fiction. So, I would have loved to have been a magazine writer in the 1960s. That would have been amazing. And just be a part of that. So yeah, or screenwriting, anything. But yeah, I'm just grateful.
In my case, I'm actually proud of having conveyed a sense of Austen to a lot of readers that they might not have had before, which is to say the complexity of her life. I think for too long she's been dismissed as this sort of two-dimensional figure of a lady who understood, genteel manners and wrote novels of manners, drawing room dramas, and that's a huge mistake, I think. And I think the fact that people continue to read her is a testament to what a mistake that is. There's universalities to her work that stem from her own complex mind and character, and that's why they continue to be relevant. So in creating a character based on Austen, which I always try to distinguish from suggesting that it is Austen, I really went for that complexity as an effort to give her my sense of authenticity, and that I am proud of. I think that it is one reason people don't simply dismiss the series as fan fiction or pastiche or some clumsy effort to exploit the world phenomenon of Austen mania. It's that authenticity. So that was important to me.
Yeah, wonderful. I believe final question. If you've got a question, you can put it in the chat, but I think this is our last one. Again from MM, and it's for Jane once again. Do you have a favorite line penned by Jane? But I'm going to expand on it after Stephanie answers.
Sure, I do actually. It's a line from Pride and Prejudice, and it's from a scene between Darcy and Elizabeth. She's playing the piano in the drawing room at Rosings, which is Lady Catherine de Bourgh's home. And she's jousting with him verbally about his awkwardness in society, and compares it to her mediocre talent at playing the piano. And he says to her, "We neither of us perform to strangers," which is a very simple sentence, but conveys so much meaning. He is saying to her, in that single sentence, we neither of us perform to strangers. He's saying, I am no longer a stranger to you, and I see you for who you are. And you are not a stranger to me. You see more of me than you understand. And I want to be intimate with you. And I feel intimate with you. And because of that, there is nothing that you could do that I would not regard as perfect. And he's also saying, I want to perform for you. I am allowing you into my very, very small circle of people who I regard as knowing me. And I hope that I'm there for you. And this scene is almost immediately followed by the scene in which he proposes marriage to her, which comes completely out of the blue to Eliza. And she is stunned and appalled and has totally missed this coming. To him, it's absolutely inevitable. He has just said to her, I know you intimately, which is a way for him of saying, I've allowed you in and I love you. So it's that kind of power in a single phrase that operates all the time in Austen's dialogue. And I find it fascinating because the more you reread her books, the more you appreciate the multiple meanings going on.
Yeah, that's so interesting, especially since you were just talking about how language today is, for lack of a better word, more efficient, but recognizing all of those multiple meanings and sentences is almost like, it kind of goes both ways a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, and then just to kind of round it all out, I do like to ask authors about media that they had consumed, maybe like songs or books or movies or really anything that either inspired the works that we're talking about, or maybe that they were listening to that had nothing to do with their books, but that were parts of their lives during the writing process. And I know some authors like to completely exclude themselves from, outside influence, but I'm just curious if there's anything that comes to mind for either of you during your writing processes for these series.
I think that everybody who reads, they're sort of scarred in a positive way by things, first encounters at a young age with literature. I have two, and both have influenced everything that I've probably ever written. One is Animal Farm, and the other one is a line from Macbeth. You know, it is a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I mean, that I'd never read anything more true than just that up until that point. You know, when I was about 15 or whatever. And yeah, that's the power of it, right? That is it at its highest level. When you read it, you read it when you're 12, 13, 14, and it just affects your thinking permanently. So I would say that because it affected my thinking, those reading stuff like that affected my writing, and it still continues to do so today.
That's wonderful. Gosh, I took your question differently as, while I'm writing, is there something I'm tapping into? And I would only say that because I also write contemporary fiction and the voices are very different, that I do have to go back and reread Austen. Generally, I read the book she was writing during the period I'm writing about her. So, for instance, in this last book, Jane and the Final Mystery, she was working on, but had basically completed, Persuasion. And she had started to draft the book that was eventually retitled Sanditon, but she called The Brothers. So both of those are interesting to me in terms of her thinking at the time, as the sort of process she was going through as a writer during the period that I'm writing about her as my character. So that's kind of a layer of complexity I have to do. But yeah, that's about it, I would say.
That's awesome. Final question. What is next for you?
I'm going to try to write fantasy. Book 3 sort of ends with the potential for a world of sort of a fantastical world. So I kind of want to do that next. I like the idea. I like bouncing around to other genres. In fact, it's kind of like that's what the books are in a way. It's sort of like, because I live in Hawaii and everything is just so fusion and mixed, whether it be race, cuisine, whatever. It's sort of like I like taking that concept and running with it, even with my fiction, right? So if with these books, I mean, it crosses from murder mystery to adventure to horror to post-apocalyptic, and I enjoy sort of fusing different genres together in my novels. So I hope to continue to do that in maybe a fantasy setting.
I actually have no idea.
That's okay.
Been there.
That's probably one of the best answers to that question.
Yeah.
Thank you again all for tuning in. Stephanie, we wish we could have seen your face today, but thank you for being here regardless. Happy pub date, Chris.
Oh, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Both of these authors' books are available, and you can buy them from Mystery to Me if you'd like to support a really wonderful independent bookstore partner. It's the season of giving, and we have a 30% off coupon code that you can use. It's endings, ENDINGS30 when you're checking out to receive 30% off. And Chris and Stephanie both signed some book plates that will be included in those packages for you. So, and that code is good until December 31st. So if you change your mind, you can always come on back and get your books. So thank you all. Thanks for being patient with us for the delay today, but we're really happy to have seen you this year, for tuning in for the lineup. And we have a really great lineup of events next year. So we'll see you in 2024. Thank you again, Chris and Stephanie.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Everybody have a great day. We'll see you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.